Chapter 4. 5 more wine blocks made their way into Montgomery's cell. Scores of new lives began and ended with the rising and falling of the springtime sun. The war plodded on. Montgomery's knowledge about his allies' movements and plans were purposefully kept fragmented and basic, on the slim chance that he was to escape and be capable of betraying them to the West dominance. Between battles, in those horribly dull and mind-melting days trapped in the coppery sphere, he would lay in cold loneliness and compose poetry in his head, haiku and sonnets and limericks, usually just amusing nonsense to keep his mind occupied and entertained, but he eventually thought of a few that expressed something sincere and authentic. There once was a man all alone, who lived out many lives like a drone. His mind became numb, and his visage was glum, when he found he had none for his own. It took him an hour to work it all out. He recited it over and over, planning to do so until he committed it to memory, but lost interest after a while. This was quiet agony, sitting here doing nothing, seeing no one and feeling nothing. He knew why they were doing this. He had remembered just that morning. Before the torture, they had told him that they wanted him to become accustomed enough to the Soulcage so that he could enter it and remain there indefinitely. That was their end game for him. Tubes connected to his arms and face and waist would keep his body alive in a comatose state. He would be their perfect specimen, the perfect eternal servant. Every prisoner they used for soul caging they tried to use full-time if they could. Where he was now was only meant to be a temporary arrangement. That was the reason why, leading up to the torture that had upended his mind, he'd refused to use the soul cage any longer. Now once again they were preparing him for that terrible fate. If that day came, he would never wake up again. He would turn into a human energy cell to power their machines and their androids. It was slavery. He would rather die than submit himself to it, but they wouldn't kill him. He was too valuable to kill. They would only torture him again, make him feel the greatest pains and fears and agonies they could devise in order to break him like they already broke him. He knew he wouldn't last half as long if they tortured him again. He was weaker now. The mere thought of torture made his mind hazy, such that he barely heard the words from the intercom commanding him to re-enter the soul cage. As he climbed inside and watched the console seal around him, he wondered whether he would remember the limerick or any of the other haiku and poems he'd invented, like "Big old metal ball, prison away from prison, stupid piece of..." Well, it wasn't important to remember them all. The soul cage took him away, and he thought for a moment that he was actually inside a real flesh and blood body. It was so convincing he actually had to pinch himself. Initially, the pinch only convinced him further. The flesh was soft and spongy, the bones and tendons in the right places. But inside he could tell something was off. He could feel the wrongness of his internal organs. This was an android body. A remarkably lifelike one, but an android still. His excitement died away somewhat. Still, it was better than being in an oily robot body or stuck in his cell. He was seated inside a cramped pod, dark as pitch, until a display in front of him turned on. On the screen, a tall-faced man with a mustache and a 3-story forehead spoke. "Geo9," he said with a sandpaper voice, "you have been selected for a very unique assignment. It is one that you will find quite favorable, especially when compared with your standard soul cage fare. Whether or not you will remain in this position for additional tests depends entirely on your capacity to cooperate today." Montgomery heaved a synthetic sigh. The words favorable and cooperate bounced off him like a paper airplane. "You are now soul caged in the body of an Oracle android Mark 12, an in-development, lifelike android built by Greenwell Technology. It is a top-secret project that you are going to test out. Am I understood so far?" Montgomery fell still and looked at the man with slow, grasping comprehension. "Yes," he stammered. His voice had a perfectly elegant, upper-class British accent which startled him. He felt at the walls of the pod and realized he was nude. The android body had no reproductive organs, giving him an unsettled feeling. He felt at his head and found well-styled brown hair. "Open the pod, Geo9, then I will explain more." The screen turned off, leaving him in darkness again. He felt around for the handle and pushed it open, letting in a barrage of light. His eyes reacted and refocused. Carefully, he stepped down a short staircase to find himself in an office room with long, flat ceiling lights and 2 wide conference tables. There, sitting at the left-hand one, was the man with the mustache, sitting in front of a wide-screen computer. He turned to Montgomery and set his chin on his fist, displaying the starry silver buttons of his blue suit coat. "Get dressed," he said. Montgomery followed the man's gaze to a rack of clothes beside a door. There were 3 sets of quality button-up shirts, 3 trousers of fine material, and shiny brown shoes. He stumbled to the rack and slowly reached out to touch a soft polyester sleeve, thumbing it like something he'd only seen in dreams. His reflection peered back at him from a mirror on the wall just beside the rack. A real set of fine clothes. For him to wear. What, too used to the jumpsuit? Joked the man. Montgomery beheld a fascination in the man's eyes. He was limber and toweringly tall, watching Montgomery with casual ease, like he didn't even know his prisoner could go over there and choke him to death if he wanted to. No, the man certainly knew. He just also knew Montgomery wouldn't dare. Part of him wanted to do it, but something was different about this assignment here today. He cleared his artificial throat and got to it. As he slipped on a set of khaki trousers and a blue-striped, long-sleeve shirt, the man leaned back in his chair and spoke again, half of his attention on the screen rather than the synthetic body he addressed. Greenwell Technology is paying us a pretty price to test out their prototype. They set out to create the most lifelike android ever developed by mankind, and looking at you now, I suspect they've succeeded. With meek gentleness, Montgomery buttoned up the shirt buttons one by one, marveling at the round plastic materials as they slipped miraculously through each vertical hole and then remained in place. He spared a glance up at the man and wondered aloud, "Why am I here? Why am I getting dressed?" A smile broadened the man's face, hidden underneath that mustache. "You're going on a date, Monty." Montgomery's glance turned to a steady stare. Fingers frozen mid-button, he felt a slow breath passing through him. "What?" "They're testing this lifelike android prototype to replicate human presence, Geo-9. He reached at the computer screen and tilted it so Montgomery could see it. Pictured there was the face of a woman with straight brown hair and a bright toothy smile, somewhere in her late 20s. Something about the image struck Montgomery to his core. The mustachioed man enlightened him. "So, you're going on a blind date with a volunteer. She has no idea who she's meeting with. She has no idea that the man she'll be meeting with will not even have a real human body." I'm to do what?" Montgomery's maze was fixed now on the face of the woman. But the mustachioed man turned back the screen to face himself and typed busily on the keyboard. "It will be easy, easier than anything you've been doing. All you have to do is talk to her, then leave once the date is over. The researchers will take care of the rest." Montgomery still couldn't process it. He knew what and why and how, and yet still he felt a deep trembling in his chest and in his gut. His toes gripped the carpeted floor. "I've just been told she is there waiting for you in the lounge. You're having tea together. Don't worry, drinking it won't short-circuit anything. Although do be careful about handling the body. It's durable, but not invincible. Now get your shoes on." He turned to Montgomery and cocked his head. "Oh, and don't disrobe. Obviously." Montgomery could hardly respond to that. He was still so shocked. He collected himself and bent down to put on his shoes. Shoes. When was the last time he'd worn real shoes? Even the android bodies he'd previously been placed inside were typically equipped with some kind of plated feet that needed no shoes. After all, why give an android shoes? Standing up fully dressed, he felt like a man for the first time in months. If the mirror told the truth, he certainly looked the part. He looked at the door and swallowed. "Any questions?" said the mustachioed man. "Is it just outside?" he said to the polished red wood. He sighed, perhaps suspecting Montgomery would attempt to flee. "Follow the arrows on the walls. Need I remind you, Geo-9, this is a heavy privilege being afforded to you. There is no room for error or rebellion. You know the punishment you will receive if you try anything you shouldn't. Do you remember the worst of them, Geo-9? He shut his eyes for a moment, burying a flicker of rage and pain. "Yes," he breathed softly. "Good. Now go and meet that woman. Be real. You will obviously be watched every moment. If you do anything to reveal purposefully that you aren't what she thinks you are, you will lose this privilege immediately and face harsh punishment. As I said, this is a very high-profile Soulcage job. Return here when you're done. I'll be waiting." With an air of finality, the man turned back to his computer, leaving Montgomery to open the door. He gripped the handle, turned it counterclockwise. The door pulled inward, and he stepped around and slipped through. The hallway was light and plain. It wrapped around to his left and right in a U-shape. Painted arrows on the walls directed patrons to their destinations. Exit stood out to him immediately, a word that meant more than anyone else in the universe could ever know. His knees went weak at the sight of it, but he caught himself. You can't escape, he reminded himself. Cafeteria, rooms 508, 34, lounge. There it was, arrow pointing left. He stepped along, hearing only his footsteps echoing on his way. With each step, each movement of his false body, he grew more comfortable in it, and yet more aware of its imperfections, its failures to replicate the human form. Still, it was very convincing. To an outside eye, it might look completely normal. For the short time he'd seen himself, he'd thought just about anyone would be fooled by it. But would she? That woman's face returned to his mind, her straight hair with long bangs on her forehead, the charming quality to her almost silly smile. She was just about his same age and appearance. Rounding a corner, he realized that he couldn't remember what the woman's eye color was. Had it been blue or green, or hazel, or brown? He was pretty sure it hadn't been brown or hazel, but not 100% sure. He rubbed his forefingers against his thumbs and felt the echo of his footsteps, real shiny shoes on his feet. In tune with his heartbeat, he walked faster. A churning, horrid, marvelous worry was building deep within him, nearly ready to burst. It begged him to be let out, and warned him never to try. He stopped dead in his tracks as he turned another corner and came face to face with an open door. The door to the lounge. He shrank back, and the worry compounded. She would see him in a moment, and she would know. In all his life, he had never seen an android realistic enough to fool anyone but a child into thinking it was real. This couldn't work. The woman would know the truth as soon as she saw him. What would happen then? Well, it was simple. Montgomery would return to his cell. A chance for connection wasted. When? When would another chance like this ever come? Hello? The soft voice bounced weakly and sweetly off the open door, and Montgomery's heart, or whatever was pumping the dyed red fluid through his veins, skipped a beat. Do it, he told himself. The worst that could happen would only happen for certain if he made no effort. So he stepped forward and stopped in the doorway with one hand on the doorframe, peering in and sucking in a big breath. Hello, he said, and laid eyes upon the woman. Her eyes were blue, bright and sky-like, with an openness so innately friendly and inviting. Her chocolate brown hair was shorter and wavier than in the photograph, but the smile was the same, somehow silly and gorgeous all at once. Her jawline had a slight wideness. Her nose sloped gently down. She was halfway standing up at a small round table with metal chairs, looking at him with a somewhat nervous smile growing on her face. Her purse, black and sleek, lay on the floor beside the chair legs. She wore a skirt matching the purse, a tan blouse, and a patterned ivory scarf draped down her chest. Darker tan-heeled shoes covered her feet. She was strikingly beautiful. I thought I heard someone, she said with a small laugh. After a moment she stuck out her hand. You're my blind date, aren't you? Yes, said Montgomery. He felt a smile alight upon him and let it guide him forward. She was not afraid, rather she was charming, unassuming and hopeful somehow, even in her simple movements, like steadily holding out that hand to shake his all the while it took him to walk over. I'm Willow, she said when he got within handshaking distance. Her eyes met his and didn't leave. He wasn't sure what he looked like, not least because he had seen himself only briefly 2 minutes prior and was in a body that little resembled his own. But he somehow didn't think about that at all as he took her soft hand in his own. In the intoxicating haze of introductions, the fear came late that she might immediately sense something off about his grip and shy away or frown and become disturbed. But he realized with eyes wide that she wasn't doing that at all. She was still grinning. Her hand broke away, and she cupped her right and left together as she looked nervously at the table. There lay 2 mugs of steaming tea. The rest of the room was elegant but plain, with counters and a refrigerator and a couch. Shall we sit? Troy just poured these for us a couple minutes ago. Must be cool enough now. She took her seat and pulled it closer to the table. The mildly nervous yet confident way she spoke and moved was so unexpected, so heartwarming, so human. Montgomery almost wanted to say something like, "You're lovely," but the words didn't quite feel right in his mouth. He sat across from her and wrapped a hand around the mug, staring at it with stillness. It was warm, and the tea looked delectable. Would Willow be able to sense how joyous he felt to be drinking something as simple as tea? Willow is a pretty name, he said, half shocked when it came out of his mouth. Her hand splayed on the table. She chuckled. Thank you, she said earnestly. Her eyes would squint just slightly whenever she smiled, and Montgomery thought he would never grow tired of it. She coughed and bit her lip. I'd return the compliment, but I don't know what your name is. He frowned and stared for a moment before laughing and sputtering. Oh, my goodness, I'm so sorry. She laughed profusely. It's all right. He searched his circuit-wired brain for a name. They hadn't told him what to say. Not this again. They must not have cared what he said, so long as he didn't reveal the truth. Baltimore, he said finally. The name was odd, but it had worked once before. Somehow it felt natural to him. My name is Baltimore, if you can believe it. Oh, she frowned thoughtfully. I do like that name. Very unique. I don't believe I've ever met someone with that name. He smiled. I'm one of a kind, then. I suppose you are. You're one of a kind, too, to me. I don't remember ever meeting a Willow before. Really? A bit surprising, but I don't mind being one of a kind. So, Willow, tell me how you... He stopped. He'd been about to ask how she had been set up with him for this blind date, but information relayed into his mind almost as he spoke. Willow had connected with him, or rather with his superiors posing as someone legitimate, through a digital dating application that boasted automated date selection and extensive background checks on users in response to a wave of nightmarish online dating crimes that had occurred in the past few decades. The application had picked this couple at random based on an algorithm designed to bring the best potential matches together. They wouldn't even have known each other's names or appearances. They would meet here in one of the company's security-laden buildings, all in the name of protecting the safety of its users. Of course, Greenwell Technology had apparently struck a deal with the owners of the app to use their service to test their new Android model, so perhaps the app wasn't as trustworthy as it claimed. Poor Willow, he thought as he strained to keep his smile. She had no idea. No idea that the man she was sitting across from, smiling at and laughing to, was false. She was politely waiting for him to finish his sentence. He cleared his throat. Tell me how you found your way here. I had a terrible time locating it. Well, I just took a cab. Ah, that would have been smart. I, walked. Really? You must not live very far from here, then? He shook his head. Not terribly far. I enjoy walking. It hit him then that he had said something true about himself for the first time. He did enjoy walking. I like walking too. If the weather is nice and not in a hurry, I tend to walk. Good for exercise. That, and it feels more real, you know? Stepping out of the world of cars and mass transit an instant. She laughed softly and then rubbed her forehead. Damn it. Willow, stop with the philosophizing, she muttered, half chuckling. Montgomery felt a soft laugh ripple through him. So new that feeling. Yet the action brought back a slew of warm old memories. Laughter and levity, hope encircling him. No, I welcome it, he assured her. I prefer to get to the good stuff than talk about the weather. Philosophy is certainly more interesting than whatever it was that I was going to say. I doubt that. I get on trains of thought, and I just never know when I ought to stop. The laughter died and left his system like an excised virus. Each time the feeling left, he wondered how he'd ever feel it again. He leaned back and crossed his arms and shrugged. Who's to say you should? You're allowed to think and say whatever you want. That wasn't meant to be a joke. She smirked. Very idealistic of you. He gave a facetious grimace. You're right, maybe it's the wrong era for thinking. But who cares? It's just us and the safety cameras here. Probably. He turned and gestured. They could be listening through the microwave, I suppose, or the door handles, or the ceiling lights, or the tea bags. She giggled, and he suddenly felt very silly when he remembered that the government, military to be precise, actually was listening in on this conversation. For the sake of his own sanity, he tried not to focus on that. He tried to think about the possibility of levity, the possibility of Willow and he genuinely having a light-hearted and pleasant time together. I wouldn't joke about that if I were you, she said with a playful cock of her head. I made the joke, but you laughed at it, so if I went away, you'd be thrown in jail right alongside me. Ha ha! Wouldn't be the worst end to a date I've ever had. He raised his brows and laughed heartily. I'll have to hear that story at some point. Ha! Maybe someday. She shook her head. Well, it's a muddy world we live in. You and I are just old enough to remember what it was like before all this. Somehow he knew exactly what she meant. Not just before the totalitarianism or before the wars. Before all of this. Before the world had grown cold. People don't feel safe anymore, he remarked with a solemn frown. Not in their own countries, not their own neighborhoods, not even their own families. When did we stop trusting each other? And when did we realize it was a wise decision? Well, part of me wants to agree with that, but devil's advocate, the world's always been rather unsafe. Not to discount your point, though, things have gotten worse. No, you're right. It would be silly to pretend people not trusting each other is new. He sighed a curious sigh. Maybe it's my idealism manifesting as nostalgia. If the world's mucked up now, if it doesn't seem like it will ever get any better, at least I can imagine that it was better once before. Make myself feel better while absolving myself of the responsibility to change anything. She nodded and clapped her hands together facetiously. That's some quality philosophy, perfectly depressing. He shook his head and laughed. Maybe you had the right idea after all. So, how about that weather? Grinning, she cleared her throat and took a sip of her tea. Then she stared down into the deep green-brown liquid. I think this tea is Japanese. Have you noticed? He hadn't drunk it yet. He raised it and took a sip. He didn't remember the flavor, though honestly he could hardly taste it for his android body. I'm not sure what flavor that is. Izu matcha, I would guess. I wonder how they got it. I wondered too. I hear that back in the West Dominance they don't get any Slav Asian products. Ah, what a shame, she said with a nod, her eyes low, as if speaking of the West Dominance was taboo. She really was afraid of listening government ears. Sensible. Montgomery cleared his throat. Perhaps he would be wise to avoid that topic from then on. He didn't want to have to pretend to hate it in conversation anyway, at least not to the level that the Europeans hated it. What did you study? She asked. She wasn't making this easy. Montgomery didn't immediately know the name of any non-Western universities or schools of any kind. He needed to tell her not about Montgomery, but about Baltimore. As much as it hurt, he needed to lie. How could he lie to her? How could he tell her the truth? I didn't, he said, and at this point the truth was feeling hazy even to him. I went into the military instead. Oh, what branch? Army. He nodded and managed a weak smile. I won't kill the mood with those stories. She laughed, probably thinking he was joking. Well, I studied social sciences at U.S. At U.S.? He said, puzzled. The University of Sussex, she clarified with a low smirk, amused by his ignorance. You thought I meant the USA? Must be an off day for me. I'm not that old, she said cheekily, eyeing him. He buried himself in his drink for a moment, feeling absurd. He set the mug back down. I've been there, to the central province. While in the military, of course. Her eyes widened a bit, and she struggled to word her next question. How was it there? It was mildly interesting, as well as stressful, making up things like this to her, like an exercise in creativity. An easier thing would have been to tell the truth, of course, but that was out of the question. Honestly, I thought it was nice overall, far less grey than this island, at least. She cocked her head ever so slightly. I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say that about a West Dominance place. Not in the last several years, at least. I'm not terribly passionate about these wars we're having, he said. Fear came to his center. He really wasn't being creative much at all. All he'd done was say what he really thought, but in a nonchalant way. If he kept that up, he was bound to make an even bigger blunder than this one. And then what would they do to him back in the cell? She sipped her tea. Is anyone really? He raised an eyebrow. I would say so. Seems like that's all anybody talks about these days. He swallowed and then added, I could be wrong. He assumed that things were more or less the same anywhere in the world, just as full of hate and devoid of mercy. But he realized he didn't know for certain. She shrugged and sighed. I suppose that's true in a sense. I try not to focus on it. Part of me feels like that it's all just a big silly mess. I shouldn't keep talking like this, really. He sat up straight. As I said, I don't care what you say. Whatever you really think is all right with me. I'll just end up saying too much. It's fine. Let's change the subject. She breathed out through her nose, mildly discomfited. We can if you want, but now I admit I'm curious what you were going to say. So accommodating, such a probing gentleman. Her laugh surprised him. All right, I'll speak and pick my words carefully, if you insist. A sudden wistfulness came over her before she went on. I don't usually share this with anyone, much less someone I only just met, but I think it's awful that we're all at war with one another. Her smile faded away. He eyed her with soberness, let her speak. All we ever talk about is how much we hate the other nations, the other people. All the rallies and the speeches and the movies. I think all this hate, this anger we direct at the other conglomerates is evidence that we're missing something inside us, she said. She leaned forward and cupped her hands together, took a deep breath. As you can tell, I've spent far too much time thinking about it. She was silent for a moment before going on. It makes me sad, seeing all these people just angry all the time. She didn't look at him. He had coaxed a great impersonal feeling out of her, and she naturally didn't know whether he would appreciate that honesty or not. Searching deep inside himself, he was elated, but not surprised to feel a great sense of solidarity. I agree, he croaked. Images of a dozen combat drops filled his mind from this past month alone. Others more distant now haunted him too. Blood and death and hatred, all of the most vile. She lifted up her eyes to meet his. At that moment Montgomery felt, synthetically, a pulse of some strange feeling he wasn't sure he'd ever felt before. All he knew was that it was pleasing, comforting, even stirring. He thought she must have felt it too. He soaked in the warmth of the mug between his hands. All the rage, all the self-righteousness hasn't solved very much, has it? Her blue eyes tracked his, discerning something she perhaps wasn't expecting to find. Nor does us two complaining about it, I suppose, she said with a sudden beam. You've got me there. No, I complain all the time. I just keep it to myself. Most people don't want to hear it, do they? She nodded profusely and clenched her teeth. I work for the government as a social worker. You'd think since I work taking care of unwanted children and orphans I would have a pretty peaceful existence, but that is unfortunately not the case. I see more of that cultural rage than I care to admit. I've got stories I could tell. Boy, do I have stories. He leaned forward. You should tell one. No, I've gone on plenty. I want to hear more about you. He slowly took another sip of tea. Well, I don't have any good stories to tell. She cleared her throat anxiously, embarrassed. I'm sorry. You must have suffered a lot in the war. He didn't respond. I am sorry, she said, her gaze brimming with sincerity. I cannot begin to understand what that is like. You don't need to understand. He managed a humble smile. Her cheeks flushed red, and she stayed quiet. Well, I want to hear more about you, and you want to hear more about me. I guess we can go over the basics one at a time, then. Should we ask each other about our families first, or is that bad territory? It's not bad territory for me. My family's doing all right. Yours? I believe so. I haven't talked to them in quite some time, he admitted. Their memories were hazy in his head, a remnant he supposed of the torture. It hurt to think of them anyway. He feared to know of the hurt they'd feel if they learned of his cruel imprisonment. I've got 2 siblings that live far away. I don't think I've spoken to them in years. Mum and Dad are getting old, but still going strong. Not too much else to say. I'm not especially close to mine either. My parents both work for the propaganda arm of the province. They aren't fanatics at heart, at least I don't think so, but they certainly reek of fanaticism by nature of the things they do. I have 3 sisters besides, so if you aren't huge on me, I can always set you up with one of them. He laughed, scratching at his hair. I don't think that's looking too likely, he said cheekily, but it's good of you to be thinking of them. Another beautiful pulse of feeling transferred between the two of them. Each pulse seemed to knit something between them. More pulses came as the conversation went on, flowing like a graceful koi fish in a pond. They talked more about careers. He shared his experience as a hotel bellhop, as it was the freshest in his mind. She didn't scoff at his unskilled labor career. As he told stories of the tough working conditions and how he dealt with them, a slew of appreciative compliments came his way that he couldn't have imagined. She grew more beautiful to him by the minute. By the time the tea was gone, an hour had passed, the most wonderful hour of Montgomery's life in any recent memory. And now he knew Willow as the hard-working, deep-thinking woman she was. He'd learned that her sisters were all married, and to 3 men of all different religions, which made family dinners challenging, what with the pork and alcohol and beef that had to be carefully prevented from going to the wrong person. He discovered her favorite color was burgundy, half because of the color itself, and half because she liked the name. He knew so much more than he'd started out knowing, and yet it would never be enough. She kept asking for more tidbits about him, and he tried his best to tell her what he could, but it was challenging. Trying to concoct his semi-false persona took so much mental energy that he could never fully take joy in her company. But if he failed to open up at all, she'd think him strange, fake. His superiors would be angry if he came across that way. It was an hour of terrible joy, sprinkled with glorious bits and stretches where he would forget that he wasn't really there, that his body was trapped in a soul cage many miles away. He felt alive, free. Before he knew it, Willow was picking up her purse. Oh, she said, I need to get going quick. My little niece is having a birthday party this evening. Those words sunk into him like barbells on his chest. That sounds fun, Montgomery said with longing. She stood up. Well, Baltimore, I had a lovely time. I did too. I'd love to do this again sometime. He stood beaming. You would? Yes, if you want to as well. Absolutely. Absolutely, though I think we should meet at a park or something outdoors instead. It's rather dreary in here. It tends to be rather dreary out there too, you know. She laughed. Let's hope we see some sunshine soon. We'll talk later then. Montgomery let boldness seize him. He stepped close to her just as she was about to start walking away and said, I don't know why I didn't say this at the start. Guess I wasn't brave enough. But, Willow, you look lovely. Absolutely lovely. Her eyes burned with emotion. Thank you, she said with softness. He felt something in his own eyes, something similar enough, he hoped. He leaned over and wrapped his arms around her. She returned in kind. Warmth. I'm glad I got to know you a little bit today. I'm serious when I say it was the most stimulating conversation I've had in months. I really hope we can see each other again soon. Her voice sounded in his ear. You have no idea how much better this date went than any of the last ones I've had this year. She laughed. If I seemed put off at all at the start, that's why. Suppose I could say the same. When she broke away, she clutched his arms. Well, I'll see you later then, Baltimore. I'll see you. She turned away with a smile, purse slung around her shoulder, and walked to the door, stealing only a small glance back at him before disappearing. Sky blue eyes. Montgomery felt something die in him as she went. He waited in that room for so long, he eventually heard the mustachioed man's voice in his head telling him to get moving. He was sure that thoughts of Willow would never ever leave his memory as long as he lived. He was a battlebot again, this time on a plane. He was strapped into a lone seat on the back, near a large metal cylinder. It was a fighter plane, and the only robot aboard was him. A pilot and co-pilot swerved the plane this way and that, tossing Montgomery's metal weight with each turn. He heard the two of them shouting and firing miniguns straight ahead. Montgomery thought he saw Western jets in the crosshairs. As usual, he had no mouth to speak with, and they wouldn't care about what he'd have to say besides. So all he could do was sit in his seat and watch as the plane spiraled and dived and took shocking hits from opposing aircrafts. They soared over the wide blue ocean, rapidly passing over a battleship. Yes, it was definitely a Western one. Why are we going so low, he wondered. They can't possibly want to land. Drop it, screamed one of the pilots. Something should have computed in Montgomery's mind, but it took a few seconds too long. He fell suddenly through the floor, and the metal cylinder went with him. The bomb. He remained strapped to the seat. Moving his body only tilted the chair helplessly in the air. Wind whistled through the holes in his rivets and joints. Horror subsumed him. The battleship, loaded with scores of men and jets and supplies, was straight below him. Some artificial form of adrenaline coursed through Montgomery's body with a force not unlike that which was to be unleashed upon this battleship momentarily. He fell at roughly the same rate as the bomb, or else was not far behind it. The sound of raging wind and screams and guns and bombs overwhelmed him completely. Impact came. He saw only a flash of light and felt his robotic body blow into pieces. Pain filled his frame even as he lost all connection with his limbs and torso. He was only aware of his fractured, splintering head for a few moments before all went black. That evening, he had no trouble falling asleep. His body felt near into paralysis, such that he could not even climb out of the console. He slept there and never felt his heart calm, wondering endlessly and woundedly why they had dropped him. He woke up in an open Soulcage console. As he climbed out, his heart was alight with dread. He thought he realized the answer to his question. It had been a test to see if he was growing accustomed enough to the physical demands of the Soulcage, enough to be kept there forever. Okay, that's the end of Chapter 4.